So can everyone see my title slide? Just to be not anyone who can. Yeah, right. Because of the way that Gmeet works, I can't actually see screens at the moment. So if you've got anything any point you want to make, bang them in the chat until I close my share down. So Paul's briefly alluded to membership of Tynwald, and my paper is going to be specifically about one aspect of that, which is the appointment by MHKs of members of the Legislative Council. And a fairly provocative quote to get us started, which is not my own, which is a reputational running saw, which I will source and explain a little bit more in a moment. I'm going to talk briefly about the way that this process of electing to the Legislative Council has evolved over more than a century. I'm going to focus on two criticisms by Lord Lisfane in his review, and then I'm going to focus on actually two of those particular points in detail. One of them is the idea MHKs electing people from Tynwald, so from their own membership or sitting MLCs or former MHKs, as a defensible constitutional practice until 1969. So I'm actually going to defend it until 1969. And then I'm going to talk about what Lisfane described as the reputational running saw of slow appointment processes and the way in which actually action has really made a difference there. And then I'm going to finish with some brief conclusions. So pre-1919, Legislative Council was composed entirely of officers led by the Lieutenant Governor. And you find little snippets of evidence that this was the imperial establishment, not simply appointees of the imperial government, but actually acting in the interests of that establishment. And multiple lieutenant governors boasted of their moral dominance and of their fellow officers. In the early 20th century, the House of Keys in particular, as part of a prolonged period of activism, petitioned for reform of the Legislative Council in 1907. This led to the MacDonald Report in 1911, which led to the Constitutional Amendment Act 1919. So what did the Act in 1919 do? The most important thing is that it shifted the Legislative Council from being composed entirely of officers to a hybrid chamber, which had some members who sat there as officers, for instance, the Deemsters, two members who were appointed by the Lieutenant Governor, this was new, and four members appointed by MHKs. The size of the Legislative Council has changed during this period, as has a proportion of members elected by the House of Keys. So the long arc from 1919 is the withering away of the ex officio members, and then the members appointed by the Lieutenant Governor to be replaced by people elected by the MHKs. We started with 4 elected members, with the rest being ex officio or appointed to the Crown, so about 35%. The balance tipped during this century-long development in 1969, when you had 8 elected members, and nowadays you have 8 elected members, 3 ex officio, only one of whom normally has a vote. So 73 to 89% of the chamber, depending on how you take the voting rights into account. So that's very interesting to me because it's a very distinctive example of what I'll refer to later as first chamber franchise. So you have members of the democratically elected first chamber in the bicameral legislature actually vote for who is going to join them in Tynwald by joining the second chamber. So from 1919, we saw this radical shift of the composition of the Legislative Council. And I would just stress to you, because I'm going to come back to it, 1969 was when the majority became elected members. Over the century, we also changed a shift in the position of the Legislative Council. Now, some of it's quite subtle as we see things happening around executive government, but I would pick 3 dates in particular here. Loss of the legislative veto, 1961. So up until 1961, the council could block legislation. Simplified override of legislative opposition, 2006. And loss of a role for legislative council members in appointment of the chief minister in 2016. So we've really seen a lot of changes in what's happening in the LC over this century. Now, Lord Lisvane was commissioned to report on the functioning of Tynwald, and it's a wide-ranging report and received considerable discussion in Tynwald in its wake. He had two concerns I want to talk about today. His first was a concern about the idea that MHKs became members of the Legislative Council, became MLCs. He noted criticisms such as it's a cushy retirement or a safe haven for MHKs who have served the government well over time. And more explicitly, he shared concerns over direct transfers, by which he means a sitting MHK leaves the chamber and becomes an MLC. And he recommended measures intended to make a clean break with a damaging perception and with no hint of a revolving door. So Lisvane was concerned that this was happening, and he felt that it needed to be addressed. He was also concerned with the quality of the process, particularly a failure to fill vacancies quickly, describing the process as a reputational running saw. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at those two particular criticisms in a bit more detail. Now, this probably looks better on my screen than it does on yours, so I may need to talk you through this one, this chart. So the first thing I want to do is to consider how far he was right. You know, how far were MHKs moving into become MLCs? Up until the 1980s, so you literally do have this flat line at zero, going well till the 1980s. Up until the 1980s, outsiders to Tynwald were not even nominated. Overwhelmingly, those were sitting MHKs or MLCs. In a small minority of cases, former MHKs or MLCs were considered, particularly where you had a by-election, which meant there was an MLC seat that only had a short period left to run. In the 1980s, outsiders began to be considered for these seats in relation to by-elections. So they began to be considered for seats which had such a short period left to run, they were not attractive to MHKs. Then as we move into the 1990s, we see outsiders being considered for normal vacancies. Lagging somewhat behind, and you should be able to see these two different lines. Lagging somewhat behind, we see appointees beginning to become successful. So people appointed from outside Tynwald, sitting in Tynwald for the first time as MLCs. And in the 21st century, we see the process increasingly dominated by such candidates, and again, dominated a little later, the successful candidates dominate being elected from outside. So in the 2020s, so far, we have 81% of candidates who are from outside of Tynwald, with 67% of those appointed being from outside of Tynwald. So not already sitting MLCs, no experience being an MLC, not sitting MHK, no experience being MHK. So I would differ from Lord Lisvane. Lord Lisvane did an excellent job at speed, but he didn't do a tremendous amount of independent data gathering. And if you actually trawl through all of the electoral records from 1919, you do see that as we get nearer to his report, this conveyor belt is less and less common. So I think the conveyor belt is completely clear before the 21st century. Difficult to argue it exists today. That's fairly clear-cut, I think, and I apologize for the graph. What I want to do now is to move on to actually this idea of defending it up until 1969. So up until 1969 and well past 1969, you see that the keys are appointing from their own membership into the MLC. And I think the foundational issue here is this struggle between national keys and imperial council. So the 1919 reforms, which remember were lobbied for by the keys, they didn't get everything they wanted, but they were the drivers for it. It allowed them to put representatives into the imperial chamber, which at that time was at least equal to the keys in power. So 1919, indirectly elected MLCs, elected by the MHKs, is actually a democratizing move. And we see appointing from the keys themselves being seen as a democratic advance. And I've got a lovely quote here from Samuel Norris, who is a noted figure. Let the people's voice expressed through representatives coming here from the electorate prevail. Coming fresh from the electors, how much more will that member carry to the new chamber that breath of fresh air which is so desirable to any country? So the idea was that at least MHKs had some democratic mandate, and Norris was arguing that actually you should try and do this quite soon after an election, so it's a very fresh democratic mandate. A national democratic mandate of members who would then go into the imperial unelected council. The Keys also saw themselves as representing this national voice, so there's a strong identification of the Manx Nation and MHKs. And this led to quite a lot of people arguing that when they elected somebody to be an MLC, they should be loyal to the House of Keys. It should be somebody who would voice the views of the House of Keys and represent the House of Keys. As Gale put it, a House of Keys man. And the argument was that the best way to make sure you do this is to elect somebody that you know, because you've worked with them as an MHK. You'll know there'll be a House of Keys man, and I could talk about gender bodies on a different paper. You would know there'd be a House of Keys man because they have been in the House of Keys, they have spent time in it, they have worked in it, they have got themselves involved in its culture. So I think up until 1969, it's actually quite defensible. The trouble I have is that after 1961, the Legislative Council no longer had an absolute veto on legislation which had passed the Keys. So this imperative to get your people into the Legislative Council in order to protect the interests of the Keys is weakened. And after 1969, the majority of the Legislative Council were elected by the Keys, not members of the Lieutenant Governor's Council or appointees of the Lieutenant Governor. So you haven't got this built-in imperial majority which you need to have a strong block against. So my feeling is that a defensible practice by which the Democratic Chamber sought to strengthen its position against the undemocratic Second Chamber had lost its justification by 1969, but the practice continued for another generation. So after the basis of the defense is gone, you still have people being elected in this way from the Keys into the Legislative Council. My second point is a bit more nerdy. The idea of a reputational running sort of a cumbersome appointments process. Now, there's things that I do as an academic, which I do just the wrong period of time apart. I do them about once every year, which means I kind of think I know how to do them, but I've actually forgotten, so I get them wrong. And I think this is what happens frequently to the MLC elections, particularly in the 20th century. You find some absolute parliamentary nightmares going on. Mr. Speaker in 1962 reviewed all of the former elections in an attempt to get some sort of process out of them and said they are in complete contradiction to each other. So the procedure was really ropey. Frequently, the House could not agree on a candidate, and this was especially pronounced 1987 to 2015. So I've not used consistent ways of putting this because the actual process has changed slightly, but I think it gives an idea of just what a protracted process it could be. Now, I think some really important reforms happened in 2017, which actually helped to address this to a large extent. So I think one of the issues is that for most of the century, election required 13 MHKs, no matter how many were voting. So if you had less than the full 24, a simple majority of the chamber wouldn't get you your result. When there were less than 24 MHKs present, there would be voting until a candidate had a majority, and then the speaker would have to call for a confirmatory vote. And sometimes that confirmatory vote would not be given. So sometimes MHKs who were not in the minority would hold out and make the process fail. It was made worse on one memorable occasion in 1970, when an MHK who'd just been elected to the council was unlawfully excluded from the rest of the voting. And he should have actually been involved in the voting of other people who would join him on the council. Reform of 2017, election by majority of those present, change to the standing orders. The other thing I want to mention, before 2017, votes were by secret ballot. On one occasion, around a voting in 1954, this was made especially secret when the speaker refused to reveal the votes that had just been cast in case it influenced future votes. That was an exceptionally bad example of that, but the secret ballot principle was well established. The secret ballot allowed MHKs to use tactics which depended upon their individual votes not being verifiable, which Mrs. Kane described as political gains, a loss of credibility and respect. Now, by its nature, tactics which depend on secrecy are very hard to pin down, but I think I've got 3 bits of evidence that they were happening. Mr. Malarkey, in his speech in favour of keeping the secret ballot, noted that you could keep your brother-in-law sweet when you didn't vote for them. So you could lie to your brother-in-law or constituent or neighbour or whoever. There was a case in 1924 when, in the middle of a round of voting, a new candidate was introduced to the process who secured no votes. He had been nominated by one MHK and seconded by another MHK, and neither of those MHKs had voted for him. So the only purpose I can see is they had introduced him in order to hopefully distract from a different candidate while they could put their votes into their preferred candidate. And an anecdote which I finally managed to track down this week, thanks to the power of Twitter, Dudley Butt, when retiring from the Legislative Council, thanked the 14 MHKs who voted for him, as well as the 20 who said that they had. So there are ways in which secrecy was used for particular tactics. Reform of 2017 switched to an open ballot. I actually have a different discussion on secret ballots in this process across the world, but the key thing to note here is in the Isle of Man it changed in 2017. Now, I think that they contributed to a much less cumbersome appointments process. 2018, 5 appointments, which is the classic large number which frequently caused problems in the past, single round of voting. 2020, 4 appointments, single round of voting. 2021, sorry, not 21, 2 appointments and a single round of voting. My concluding thoughts. Liz Fane's criticism of the MHK-MLC link was justified after 1969, but it was already out of date by the time it was being made. We already saw a significant change in the demographics of those being nominated for and then elected to the Legislative Council. Subsequent elections have continued this trend of MHKs appointing to Tynwald rather than from Tynwald. Liz Fane's criticism of the appointment process was current, and the 27 reforms which followed, but which are built on pre-Liz Fane unhappiness and thinking about the process, made significant changes, which I think was evidence they've eliminated the long drawn-out processes seen as reflecting so poorly on Tynwald. And I'm writing this up as a comparative paper for a global readership, and one of the things I'm arguing is that actually the Manx experience of refining the process over more than a century provides a model for other systems, considering this form of first chamber franchise. So actually some of the things that have been done to make it work more effectively are, I think, well worth considering by other jurisdictions who may take this route.